Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Well, Michael Flynn will be Donald Trump's national security advisor. Flynn was a U.S. Army lieutenant general and served as the director of Defense Intelligence Agency from 2012 to 2014. Previously, Flynn was a senior intelligence officer for the International Security Assistance Force, U.S. Central Command, the Joint Staff, and Joint Special Operations Command. He's been virulently hostile to the Iran nuclear deal and is known for very hostile views towards Islam, recently tweeting a video which argues that the term Islamophobia is an oxymoron because, quote, fears of Muslims is rational. Now joining us to talk about who Flynn is and just what he might be saying in President Bush's ear as he advises him is Ray McGovern, who now joins us. Ray leads the Speaking Truth to Power section of Tell the Word, a publishing arm of the Ecumenical Church of the Savior in inner-city Washington. He's a retired CIA officer and was employed under 7 U.S. presidents for over 27 years, presenting the morning intelligence briefings at the White House under Presidents Reagan and H.W. Bush. Thanks very much for joining us again, Ray. So tell us a bit about Flynn. He had a reputation, it's been reported amongst other generals, that he was so, what's the word, crazy, so hawkish, that even some of the other generals wanted him out, and certainly the Obama administration wanted him out. But what more do we know about him and what he might be saying about to be President Trump?
Well, there's a thin line between hawkish and ambitious in this town for the last several years. It's hard to conceive that Mike Flynn believes the kinds of things that he said. And the militarism in evidence at the Republican convention and the Democrat convention with John Allen, General U.S. Marine Corps, marching in cadence with other people. It's unbelievable. Anyhow, what has Flynn really, what has he said about Iran, which seems to be the fly in the ointment? Well, there's a testimony he gave in June of last year, that is 2015, right before the conclusion of that famous and very good agreement, which limits Iranian aspirations to get a nuclear weapon. And what he said was this. He said, Iran's intention to build a nuclear weapon is clear. That's what he said on page 1. On page 2, he said, we do not know whether Iran will eventually decide to build a nuclear weapon. Oh, well, that's interesting, isn't it? It's clear, though. Now, he goes on to say, what we have here is a threat to Israel. That's the big thing. Iran's stated desire to destroy Israel is very real. They are surrounding Israel. It's a clear and present danger to Israel. The community in the area, we have our eyes on the totality of the Iranian nuclear program, but we still don't know what's hidden. What he says here is that Iran is able to make a nuclear weapon without us observing us. That's a lie, okay? And it's also a lie to pretend 8 years after a national intelligence estimate unambiguously and unanimously said Iran stopped working on the nuclear weapon part of its nuclear program at the end of 2003. I'll say it again. At the end of 2003, which judgment has been reaffirmed, reasserted every year since, and Mike Flynn knows that better than anybody else. So he's either got some Alzheimer's or he's being very disingenuous when he talks about Iran. And the fellowship, if you can call it that he's fallen in with are equally avid to reverse the progress made toward Iran and start God knows what.
What is his track record while he was he worked with Stanley McChrystal in Afghanistan? What do we know about him as a general?
Well, not much about a general because he was an intelligence type, and they are usually not operational people. What I do know is that torture took place there, and that Mike Flynn knows an awful lot about that. When Petraeus came in, he came in with new orders saying, you know, as long as U.S. soldiers don't do torture. The Iraqis, that doesn't really matter. We won't interfere with that. The way we know that is the most bizarre testimony by Rumsfeld and that Marine general who was Peter Pace, who was the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff for just one term. Rumsfeld said, well, all we have to do is report torture. We don't have to stop it. And Pace, in an amazing interference, said, no, Mr. Secretary, my orders are to stop it on the spot. And Rumsfeld said, no, that's not right. And indeed, Peter Pace, General, U.S. Marine Corps, Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was in the dark because Petraeus had instructions called 242, an instruction which said, U.S. probably shouldn't torture anymore, but if the Iraqis do it, we can turn a blind eye.
Right.
That is what that Mike Flynn knows about, and it's really pretty unconscionable.
There's been some contradiction or some differences between Trump and Vice President Pence, and everyone is reporting, and the evidence seems to be that Pence is going to be an extraordinarily powerful vice president. When asked who he would model his vice presidency on, Pence said Dick Cheney, who probably was the most powerful vice president ever. Many people thought, at least in the Bush's first term, refer to it more almost as President Cheney's first term. Pence has been very aggressive in his talk about Russia, certainly no less than Clinton's was, and perhaps even more. Pence's biggest critique of Clinton's foreign policy is that she was weak on Russia. He wanted an even more aggressive posture. Trump, on the other hand, has made some talk about there's ways to negotiate and deal with Russia and deal with Putin. I guess it's yet to be seen who's really going to call the shots on this. Trump, on his side, has been far more aggressive in his rhetoric about China. And it seems to be, which one do you want to take on first? Trump wants to be China first, and Pence seems to be more on the traditional neocon page at the moment, which is you focus more on Russia. All that being said, there's one thing Trump and Pence agree on, and it's one thing Flynn agrees with them on, and it's one thing all the people so far being talked about for Secretary of State, whether it's Giuliani or whether it's Bolton. Apparently now, as we record this, there's a rumor going about Romney. But all of them agree on one thing: get rid of the deal with Iran and target Iran. And that seems to me a rather dangerous, fundamental foreign policy proposition.
It could not be more dangerous, Paul. Witness the fact that this keynote agreement, this Keystone Agreement, was done not only by the United States, but by the other Security Council members and West Germany. The trade benefits are immense. Even Boeing is kind of interested in this going through. So I hope, and it's just a hope, that Trump will start to listen to other people, including our military. Now, unless the new General Dunford from the Marine Corps is different from his predecessor, Admiral Mullen from the Navy, he's going to warn the president, because after you start bombing Iran, what happens then? Now, if you think that Iran has terrorist capabilities throughout the world, which incidentally they haven't been using for the last several years, I think they do have those potentials, and it will be very, very interesting to see if bombing Iran seems to be a solution rather than another swamp that we get involved in that part of the world.
I mean, I agree with you. The problem is these are all the same arguments that were made about Iraq. I personally could not. I kept saying, they can't invade Iraq. It's just going to be such a disaster. Never mind a horrible disaster for the Iraqi people, but a disaster for the American foreign policy in the region. And everybody that knew anything about the region was saying that. Bush 1 advisors were all writing op-eds in the Washington Post. I interviewed John Kiriakou, who told me that there was a morning phone call of heads of agencies, heads of the various Pentagon departments, every morning in the year leading up to the Iraq War. And he said all of the agency heads were against the invasion of Iraq, all making the argument it will be a disaster You don't know, you can't control what happens next. Some were making the argument you're actually going to wind up giving Iran more power in the region. And Kyriakou says this phone call, this morning phone call, every day is chaired by Dick Cheney. And Cheney, he said, and this is, you can go watch my interviews with Kyriakou. This is all on camera, and I did a reality asserts itself with him. And Cheney says, well, then quit, or you'll be fired. You're either on board with this invasion of Iraq, or you're out. And of course, all the predictions of what a disaster would happen came true. And when they asked Pence, who do you want to model your vice presidency after? His answer is Dick Cheney.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you got to remember that Dick Cheney was at least officially a deputy, okay? And the committee that John Kyriakou is talking about was the Deputies Committee, okay? So not even George Tenet, the head of the CIA, was on that committee. Rather, it was a very malleable person named John McLaughlin, and so on throughout the intelligence community. Now, what was George Tenet saying? He was saying, you want to make a war in Iraq? We can come up with evidence to show that they're working on weapons of mass destruction. It's a slam dunk. So what John is reflecting are the professional attitudes in the intelligence community, the policy community. This was crazy. But Dick Cheney was in charge, and Dick Cheney also was in charge of torture. One of the major newspapers in this country called him the vice president for torture. Now, he still brags about having approved waterboarding. He still says, I do it again in a what did you say, in an eye flash or something. And so here's Mike Pence, conservative, Christian, fundamentalist, saying, oh yeah, well, Dick Cheney's very good. I mean, you know, if I get Christian correct, and I think I'm Christian of a different persuasion from Pence, you know, doesn't he realize that Jesus Christ was tortured to death? Doesn't he realize that torture belongs in the moral category of intrinsic evil, always wrong, like slavery or rape? And yet he's saying, oh, hey, this would be good. Dick Cheney is the guy I'm going to emulate. My God, what have we come to?
Well, for that matter, Trump defends waterboarding and torture, too.
Well, he's going to do more of it. So this is very disquieting. And, you know, the only glimmer of hope is that the International Criminal Court is going to start to look into whether or not our leaders, Bush and Cheney and the rest of them, or the soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan in particular, will be held accountable. That's the only glimmer of hope I've seen, and that really remains to be seen.
Yeah, because this is, in my mind, an extension of the politics of the Project for New American Century, and a document from the late 90s. And if people haven't read that, it's still online. You need to go read this and see this document, because this was the programmatic document for the Cheney-Rumsfeld-Bush foreign policy, which essentially was, this is now a single superpower world, and America no longer needs international law, and the United States should use its power to reshape the world as it sees it, and the route should be taken is regime change in Iraq, regime change in Syria, and then, of course, the real objective, Iran. And I think they're just picking up where the Bush-Cheney administration left off, and it's a very dangerous situation. Final word, Ray?
Well, the antecedent for the Project for the New American Century was a paper done mostly by American neocons, Richard Pearl or Doug Feith, for Netanyahu, first time he became prime minister of Israel. It was called A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm, the Israeli realm. And that's what's been driving a lot of our policy. One cannot begin to understand U.S. policy in Syria over the last 5 years without realizing, cui bono, who's profiting from it? The Israelis have said as much. They've said our preferred outcome is no outcome, because as long as Sunni and Shia are at each other's throats, not only in Syria, but in the whole area, quote, Israel has nothing to fear from Syria. That is what's getting our president and our Secretary of State to say Assad has to go. That's what's continuing the carnage there. And I believe that there is a chance now that Trump get together with Putin and say, all right, now, how are we going to do this? And Putin will say, well, we had an agreement. And all of a sudden, your Air Force bombed the hell out of Syrian army positions on the 17th of September. So let's go back to the agreement. Let's get the people involved, the parties involved, the people of the state in this, get them together like we used to do on such issues, and figure out how to do it before we bomb the hell out of everybody else, including ISIS.
Well, I think the more likely deal, we'll see, you and I may debate this in another interview, the more likely deal, if there's a deal, is they say, Russia, what do you want to throw Assad under the bus? In other words, keep the Syrian state as is, the Iraqi Syrian army as is, but without Assad. But the real driving thing, I think, for Israel is not just the Syrian chaos, because I think there is some danger to them in that. What they really want is they want to cut the legs out of Hezbollah, and both in terms of tying them down in Syria, and they really want the overthrow of Assad and the Syrian-Iranian connection to stop arms shipments to Hezbollah, because I don't think Israel has a much bigger objective right now than trying to get rid of Hezbollah. And now they've got an American group in power that's fully on board with them on that.
Well,
not to say the last one wasn't.
No,
and Clinton would have been.
You're right on the ground there. In other words, the immediate objective is to prevent the resupply of Hezbollah. That's very clear. How do you do that? You have chaos in Syria.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to talk more in the future. Thanks very much for joining us, Ray.
Most welcome, Jay. Paul.